They mocked her shaky hands. In a high desert wind, 5 impossible targets waited at 2,000 yards. Everything depended on her staying silent. A secret was buried in that tremor, a truth they were not ready for. The wind knew it, but it wasn't telling. The woman signed her name on the entry roster. Anya Voronin. The pen wobbled between her fingers, leaving a spidery, uncertain signature. The corporal behind the desk, a kid with sun-bleached hair and an easy smirk, glanced from her hand to her face and back again. He saw a woman in her late 30s, with plain features and eyes that seemed to absorb the flat, gray light of the prefabricated administration building. Her hands, however, were the main event. They possessed a fine, constant tremor, a nervous energy that made the simple act of holding a pen look like a monumental effort. He slid the visitor's pass across the counter without a word, the smirk doing all the talking. She took it, her unsteady fingers fumbling for a moment before securing the plastic clip to her simple jacket. Anya offered no explanation, no apology for the tremor. She simply turned and walked out into the biting wind of the Alkali Flats proving ground, a place where legends were forged and frauds were exposed with brutal efficiency. The base was a study in hostile architecture. Low, 10 buildings hunkered down against a landscape that wanted them gone. Young soldiers, lean and sharp in their fatigues, moved with the arrogant precision of youth. They were the tip of the spear. She, it seemed, was just a clerical error, a misplaced analyst sent to observe. Her presence was an anomaly, an unwelcome piece of a puzzle no one had the patience to solve. Colonel Madsen saw the name on his daily briefing sheet and frowned. Civilian analyst Anya Voronin. On-site observation. Range 7-inch, he tapped the tablet with a thick finger. Who is she? Why is my elite sniper course hosting a paper pusher from logistics? His aide, a young captain with an immaculate uniform, had no answer. Orders came down from command, sir. Level 9 clearance, Madsen grunted. Level 9, meant it was above his pay grade to question, but not to resent. He found her an hour later, standing alone near the edge of the firing line on Range 7. His snipers were unboxing their M2010S, the instruments of their trade, with the reverence of priests handling holy relics. Anya stood apart, her hands tucked into her pockets, her gaze fixed on the distant heat shimmer rising from the valley floor. Varnin, Madsen said, his voice a low growl designed to assert authority. She turned, her eyes meeting his without fear or deference. Colonel, her voice was quiet, steady, a stark contrast to her hands. I trust you're finding your observation. Observational, he said, the condescension barely veiled. What exactly is an analyst looking for out here? A misplaced decimal point in our ballistic data? The young snipers nearby snickered. They saw her, too, the quiet woman with the old jacket and the shaky hands. They saw a liability, a distraction. The wind, she answered simply, turning her gaze back to the vast, empty expanse. I'm watching the wind, Madsen scoffed. The wind, he repeated, as if it were the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. He left her there, a solitary, trembling figure in a world of unshakable confidence. He had a program to run. He had no more time for mysteries. Anya ignored the dismissal. She had been dismissed by bigger men than Colonel Madsen. She let their low laughter wash over her, as meaningless as the dust devils skittering across the flats. Her focus was absolute. She wasn't just watching the wind, she was reading it. She saw the way it curled down from Razorback Ridge, splitting into unseen currents in the valley, a treacherous, invisible river known to the range masters as the Witch's Kettle. She noted the spin of the tumbleweeds, the subtle bend in the coarse grass, the way the mirage danced like water over the targets 2,000 yards away. These were not random acts of nature. They were paragraphs in a language she had spent a lifetime learning. As she stood there, a gust of wind pushed back the sleeve of her jacket, revealing a faded tattoo on her forearm. It was a simple, stark image of a raven in flight, its lines blurred with time. It wasn't the clean, machine-made art of modern soldiers. It had the raw, hand-poked look of an artifact from a forgotten war. One of the younger sergeants, a man named Reyes, noticed it. He saw the bird, then looked back at her quiet, focused face. Something didn't add up. He had seen tattoos like that before on old-timers from conflicts the history books barely covered. They were markers, symbols of things better left unspoken. He saw her eyes narrow, tracking something he couldn't see. She knew this place, or places just like it. This was not observation. This was a homecoming. The exercise began. The qualifier is simple, gentlemen. The lead instructor barked, his voice straining against the wind. 5 targets, 2,000 yards. You have a 10-minute window. The wind is a factor. Make it count. The first sniper, a cocky lieutenant with a string of competition wins, settled behind his rifle. He consulted his Kestrel weather meter, plugged the data into his ballistic computer, and took his shot. The crack of the rifle was sharp, but it was followed by a disappointing silence. A spotter called it out. Miss. 2 meters left. The wind had snatched the bullet and thrown it aside like a toy. The lieutenant cursed, his confidence visibly fractured. One by one, the best snipers the unit had to offer took their turn. Each one failed. The witch's kettle was in a foul mood, its currents shifting and swirling with malicious unpredictability. Their advanced technology was useless against its raw power. Frustration soured the air. Grunts of anger replaced the earlier swagger. Colonel Madsen stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight. This wasn't just a training failure. It was a preview of an upcoming mission in a region with identical geography. His best men were being humbled by a patch of angry air. He was about to call off the exercise, to concede defeat to the elements, when he saw movement. It was the woman. Anya Varnin was walking toward the firing line. She moved with a quiet purpose that silenced the grumbling. The recruits watched, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity on their faces. She approached the rifle the lieutenant had just abandoned. She ran a hand along its stock, a strange, gentle gesture, as if greeting an old friend. The tremor was still there, pronounced in the cold air. A few of the men exchanged mocking glances. This was going to be pathetic. Anya ignored their judgment. She also ignored the sophisticated digital scope and its useless computer. Her fingers, though shaking, moved with an eerie sureness over the manual elevation and windage turrets. Click, click, click. She made her adjustments based not on data, but on feel, on the story the wind had been telling her all morning. She settled onto the firing mat, her body sinking into the earth. She pulled the rifle stock in her shoulder, nestled her cheek against the cold metal, and the most incredible thing happened. The shaking stopped. The moment she was one with the rifle, the tremor vanished completely. It was as if the weapon had absorbed her nervous energy, channeling it into a state of absolute stillness. The world narrowed to the circle of her scope. She breathed out, her pulse slowing to a crawl. The wind howled, but in her mind, it was a clear, steady note. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, and for a long second, the only sound was the wind. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound drifted back from 2,000 yards away. Ping! A profound silence fell over Range 7. It was heavier than the rifle's report, deeper than the valley itself. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The instructors stared at the spotting scope, then at each other, their faces masks of disbelief. The recruits, who had been ready to laugh, were frozen. Colonel Madsen's arms uncrossed. He took a half-step forward, his eyes locked on the small, still figure on the mat. Impact. Dead center. A spotter whispered into his radio, his voice filled with a reverence that hadn't been there a moment before. Anya worked the bolt on the M2010 with fluid efficiency. The spent casing ejected, a glint of brass in the harsh sunlight. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the shock wave of awe she had just sent through the assembled men. Her focus was absolute, already on the next target. The young sergeant, Reyes, let out a slow breath. No way, he muttered, not to anyone in particular. There's no way. The wind was still a hurricane downrange. The mirage was still a churning mess. What she had just done was not supposed to be possible. She made another minute adjustment to the scope, a single click of the turret. She settled back into the rifle. She fired. Again the crack, the weight, and then the beautiful, impossible sound. Ping. Madsen's face was a stone carving. The patronizing smirk, the institutional arrogance. It had all been stripped away, scoured clean by those two impossible shots. He was no longer a colonel addressing a subordinate civilian. He was a witness. "Do it again," he commanded. The words were not a challenge. They were a plea. He needed to see it again to believe it. He needed to understand what he was looking at. Anya didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear him. She was in her own world, a place of wind, steel, and mathematics, so intuitive it bordered on supernatural. She chambered a third round. The process was identical. The calm, the stillness, the perfect union with the machine. She fired. Ping. The third impact echoed across the valley. The men on the line were no longer soldiers watching a demonstration. They were acolytes in the presence of a master. She fired a fourth time. Ping. Then the fifth. Ping. 5 shots. 5 hits. At 2,000 yards, through the swirling chaos of the witch's kettle, using manual adjustments on a rifle she had never touched before. When the 5th ring of steel faded, Anya pulled her cheek away from the stock. And just like that, the tremor returned to her hands as she rested them on the mat. She had done what was asked. The impossible was now simply a fact. That evening, the fluorescent lights of Colonel Madsen's office hummed, a sound that grated on his frayed nerves. He couldn't reconcile the image of the woman with the shaky hands and the 5 perfect shots. It violated every rule of marksmanship he had ever known. He sat at his terminal and pulled up the file for Anya Varnon. Logistics analyst. GS. 12-inch. It was a thin, unremarkable digital history. Security clearances for supply chain software, travel vouchers for conferences on inventory management. It was a perfect cover, driven by a deep, gnawing instinct. Madsen used his own command credentials to push for a higher level of access. He typed in his authorization codes, feeling like he was prying open a door he wasn't meant to touch. The screen flickered. A new file materialized, heavily layered with black redactions. Most of it was unreadable, a wall of digital ink. But 2 words escaped the censor's pen. Operation Winter Raven. Madsen's blood ran cold. It was a ghost story, a classified legend whispered about in secured briefing rooms. A black operation from the early, dirtier days of the War on Terror. Below the operation name was a single, unredacted call sign. Baba Yaga. He felt the air leave his lungs. Baba Yaga wasn't a man. She was a myth, a boogeyman sniper credited with kills so improbable they were officially dismissed as battlefield rumors. He scrolled down. There was an old photo, grainy and dark. It was a younger Anya, her face hard and thin, her eyes holding the same unnerving stillness. Attached was a single commendation, citing 5 confirmed enemy kills at over 2,000 yards during a sandstorm in the Anbar province. The final line of the after-action medical report noted a combat injury resulting in a minor but persistent peripheral nerve condition, a condition that diagnostics showed vanished completely under the pressure and focus of handling a precision weapon. The shaky hands weren't a weakness. They were a scar. The next morning, the desert air was still and cold. Anya was zipping her duffel bag in the transient barracks, her movements economical and final. Her job here was done. As she stepped outside, she saw Colonel Madsen waiting for her. Behind him, standing in loose formation, were the snipers from Range 7. They were cleaning their rifles, but their work had stopped. They were watching her. Madsen did not speak. He simply walked toward her until they were a few feet apart. He looked at her, at the quiet analyst who was anything but, and then he did something that stunned every soldier present. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and rendered a sharp, formal military salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement from one warrior to another, transcending rank and station. The young recruits, including Reyes, immediately followed his lead, their hands snapping to their brows in silent unison. Anya Varnon stopped. She looked at the colonel, then at the faces of the young men who had mocked her a day earlier. Their expressions were now ones of unadulterated awe. She was a civilian now, and a salute was not hers to return. Instead, she gave a single small nod. It was barely a movement, a slight inclination of her head, but in the silent desert, it was enough. It was an acceptance, a dismissal, a farewell. She turned without another word and walked toward the waiting transport vehicle, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder. The tremor was visible in the hand she used to pull open the heavy door. Reyes watched her, his eyes moving from her unsteady hand to the distant, sun-glinted targets on the valley floor. He was finally beginning to understand that the deepest strengths are often hidden behind the most visible frailties. Colonel Madsen held his salute until the vehicle's door closed, obscuring her from view. The last thing he saw was the faded raven tattoo on her forearm, a fleeting sigil of a life he could barely imagine. As the transport pulled away, kicking up a plume of fine dust, a faint sound carried on the wind. It was the high, resonant hum of the steel targets, still vibrating from the 5 impossible impacts. The sound lingered in the quiet air, a final testament to a master's touch. Her power wasn't in a boast or a story. It was in the ringing steel, a silent strength honored, at last, by the silent desert.